1. The Whispering Shadows. It started as a routine caving trip for Reddit user Lost Explorer 87 and their group of close-knit friends. They had explored caves before, but this particular cave had a reputation. Locals called it the Black Maw, a massive cavern system hidden deep within the forested mountains, known for its twisting tunnels and subterranean rivers. Most stayed away, citing the difficulty of navigating its narrow passages and the strange rumors about the place. The warnings didn't bother them. After all, spelunking was their hobby, and danger was part of the thrill. After securing their gear and ensuring their ropes were properly anchored, the group descended into the mouth of the cave. The first few hours were uneventful, filled with the usual banter and the occasional splash of water as they waded through the shallow pools inside the entrance. It was the kind of camaraderie you build when you've faced dangerous terrain together before. But then, just as they were about to enter the deeper sections of the cave, one of them stopped short, his flashlight beam flickering off the dark, jagged walls. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The rest of the group went quiet, and for a moment there was nothing, just the sound of their breathing and the dripping water echoing around them. Then they heard it too, a faint whisper, almost like the wind, but they were too far underground for any wind to be passing through. The whispers were incoherent at first, more like a distant murmur carried through the air, but they were persistent. The group brushed it off as paranoia, the result of the cave's natural acoustics playing tricks on their minds. But, as they ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, and it was clear they weren't coming from any of them. The deeper they went, the more unnerved they became. The voices didn't just echo in the vast darkness. They seemed to follow them, slithering around the walls like some unseen predator. One of the group members joked nervously that it sounded like the cave was speaking to them, but no one laughed. The whispers had begun to take on a more distinct tone, resembling actual words, though still too garbled to understand. Hours passed, and the group reached what they believed to be the deepest chamber in the system. It was a vast, cathedral-like cavern, with towering stalactites hanging down from the ceiling like the teeth of a beast. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, even for a cave. It wasn't long before the whispers returned, louder now, swirling all around them. And this time, they weren't just random noises. They could hear their names. One by one, the whispers began calling out to them, softly at first, but growing more insistent with each passing minute. Each person in the group heard their name, and then something worse. A faint overlapping sound of footsteps shuffling in the darkness just beyond the range of their lights. Panic set in. The group huddled together, their flashlights scanning the cavern, but nothing appeared. Still, the whispers didn't stop, and neither did the footsteps. It was as if something was circling them, staying just out of sight, taunting them with its presence. Suddenly, one of the group members screamed. His light had caught something moving in the darkness, a shadow, darker than the cave walls themselves, slithering across the rocks like smoke. But when he turned his light back, it was gone. They decided then and there that it was time to leave. Quickly, they retraced their steps, but the cave had somehow become more labyrinthine. Every tunnel looked the same, and every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper instead of closer to the surface. All the while, the whispers never stopped. They grew louder, more chaotic, and now the group could hear more than just words. They could hear laughter, sinister and low, as if the cave was mocking them. As they scrambled to find their way out, their lights began to flicker. First one, then another. Total darkness enveloped them, save for a single light still glowing faintly. It illuminated their surroundings just enough to see that the shadows were no longer just on the walls. They were moving, twisting, and shifting, alive. It took hours, or at least what felt like hours, for the group to finally find the exit. The whispers faded as they neared the mouth of the cave, but even after they emerged into the light of day, the terror lingered. They spoke little of what they had experienced, but one thing was clear. Something was down there, something that had been waiting in the darkness, and as they walked away, they could still faintly hear the cave whispering behind them, calling their names once more. 2. The Lost Explorer. Reddit user CaveTrekker23 was no amateur when it came to caving. He'd explored more cave systems than he could count, from the sprawling caverns of the American Midwest to the lava tubes of Iceland. So when he heard about the disappearance of another caver, an experienced explorer named Jackson, he was intrigued. Jackson had vanished without a trace while exploring an uncharted section of a cave system known as the Serpent's Coil. It was notorious for its narrow, twisting tunnels and unpredictable drop-offs. Despite search parties combing the area for weeks, Jackson was never found. Determined to find answers, Cavatrekker 23 and his team decided to undertake an expedition into the Serpent's Coil, equipped with advanced gear, detailed maps, and enough supplies to last them several days. They set off with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their plan was to follow Jackson's last known path and hopefully uncover the mystery of his disappearance. The entrance to the cave was deceptively inviting, a wide, open mouth leading into a broad, sloping tunnel. The first few hours passed uneventfully, and the group moved swiftly through the more familiar sections of the cave. As they progressed, the tunnels grew narrower, forcing them to crawl through tight spaces that made even seasoned cavers nervous. But it wasn't until they reached the uncharted sections of the cave, the areas Jackson had been exploring, that the mood shifted. Almost immediately they could feel it, an oppressive, heavy silence that clung to the walls, making every sound seem amplified. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, and the farther they ventured, the more the cave seemed to resist them. The tunnels grew colder, the air staler. And then they found the first sign of Jackson. It was a rope, frayed and hanging loosely from a jagged outcrop, leading down into a narrow crevice. It looked like it had been hastily tied, as if Jackson had been in a hurry to descend. Cavatrekker 23 and his team exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this was likely the last place Jackson had gone, but something about it felt wrong. The crevice was impossibly tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and descending into it would be risky. Still, they couldn't turn back now. One by one, they lowered themselves into the crevice, feeling the cold stone pressing in on all sides. The descent seemed to go on forever, the rope swaying slightly as they went deeper. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small chamber, barely large enough for the whole group to stand in. The air was suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in, but that wasn't what caught their attention. In the far corner of the chamber lay Jackson's pack, covered in dust. But Jackson was nowhere to be seen. The discovery filled the group with both relief and dread. They were on the right track, but where was Jackson? His pack looked untouched, as though it had been left there intentionally, but there were no other signs of him, no tracks, no tools, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished. As they inspected the pack, one of the team members noticed something carved into the stone wall. It was a crude symbol, an inverted triangle with lines crossing through it. None of them had seen anything like it before, and the sight of it sent a chill down their spines. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the crevice above them, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of stones being knocked together. It was faint, but unmistakable. They froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing louder and more erratic, like something, or someone, was moving above them. Panic began to set in. They had to get out. But as they hurried to ascend the rope, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. One of the climbers, midway up the rope, let out a scream and lost his grip, falling back into the chamber. When the others rushed to help him, they saw his face pale with terror. "Something touched me," he whispered. "I swear, something cold grabbed my leg." They scanned the walls and the rope, but there was nothing there. Still, none of them could shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in that chamber. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. They climbed as fast as they could, desperate to reach the surface. But as they crawled through the narrow tunnels, the fear only intensified. Every shadow seemed to shift, every crevice a potential hiding place for something unseen. And then, just as they neared the exit, they heard it, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." It was Jackson's voice. They emerged from the cave into the harsh light of day, hearts pounding and minds reeling. None of them ever returned to the Serpent's Coil, and to this day, Jackson remains missing. But the team knew one thing for sure. Whatever had taken him was still down there waiting in the dark. 3. The Cave of Endless Screams. It all started with a dare. Reddit user Shadowcrawler94 had heard the stories about the cave for years, whispered by locals and passed along like folklore at campfires. It was known as the Cave of Endless Screams, an unassuming cave hidden deep in a remote stretch of wilderness. Few people had ventured into its depths, and even fewer had returned. Those who did come back were never the same. Shaken, pale, haunted by something they refused to talk about. The cave's infamous reputation had earned it a place in local legends, and most people avoided it out of a mix of fear and superstition. But not Shadowcrawler. For him, the cave represented the ultimate challenge, a mystery waiting to be solved. The thought of something supernatural lurking in the dark was laughable to him, just a collection of scary stories meant to keep thrill-seekers away. So, when his friends dared him to spend a night inside the cave alone, he accepted without hesitation. Armed with a flashlight, a recording device, and enough supplies to last through the night, he set out one cool autumn evening, determined to prove that the cave was nothing more than an overhyped tourist trap. The mouth of the cave was wide and yawning like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. As Shadowcrawler 94 stepped inside, the temperature immediately dropped, the cool air clinging to his skin like cold fingers. He clicked on his flashlight and took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. The beam of light illuminated the rocky walls, jagged and uneven, but the cave appeared empty, just a dark, silent void stretching endlessly before him. He walked deeper, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, accompanied only by the distant drip of water trickling from the ceiling. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no strange sounds or eerie sensations. After about an hour of exploring, he found a small alcove in one of the tunnels and decided to set up camp for the night. He unpacked his gear, set up his recording device, and leaned back against the cold stone wall, listening to the sound of his own breathing. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The cave was eerily quiet, save for the occasional crack or drip of water. But as midnight approached, something changed. It started faintly at first, a soft, barely audible sound carried on the air, like the rustling of leaves. Shadowcrawler 24 dismissed it as the wind or the natural sounds of the cave shifting. But then the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something that sent a chill crawling up his spine. It was a scream. A distant, high-pitched scream, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the cave. Shadowcrawler 4 sat up, his heart pounding. He strained to listen, but the scream faded as quickly as it had come. Was it just his imagination? He shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of unease that had begun to settle over him. But then it happened again. Another scream, this one louder, more desperate, and then another. The screams multiplied, overlapping each other as though a dozen people were screaming all at once, their voices bouncing off the walls, filling the air with an unbearable cacophony of terror. They were coming from deeper within the cave, but no matter how far he shined his flashlight, he couldn't see anything. The tunnel in front of him was empty, a void of darkness, stretching endlessly ahead. He stood up, gripping his flashlight tightly. His initial bravado had faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The screams continued, rising and falling, as if the cave itself was alive, moaning in agony. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the weight of unseen horrors. Panic began to set in. He knew he should leave, but something about the screams compelled him to move forward. It was as if they were calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the darkness. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound, his footsteps growing faster as the screams intensified. They were no longer distant. They were close, so close that it felt like they were right next to him, surrounding him, suffocating him. He turned a corner and froze. There, in the center of the tunnel, was a figure, a man crouched low to the ground, his back turned to Shadowcrawler 94. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and covered in dirt, and he was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself in a low, frantic voice. "Help me," the man whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "They're coming. They're always coming." Shadowcrawler felt his blood run cold. He took a step closer, his voice shaking as he called out to the man, "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing down here?" The man didn't respond. He just kept rocking, his muttering growing louder, more hysterical. And then, without warning, he let out a blood-curdling scream, a scream so loud and piercing that it echoed through the entire cave, drowning out every other sound. The man whipped around, his eyes wide with terror, and for the first time, Shadowcrawler Matui 4 saw his face. It wasn't human. The man's eyes were hollow, empty sockets where his pupils should have been. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and from his throat, the screams continued to pour out louder and louder until it felt like the cave itself was vibrating with the sound. Shadowcrawler TT4 stumbled backward, his heart racing. He turned and ran, the screams following him, growing louder with each step. They weren't just coming from the man anymore. They were coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as if the entire cave was alive with the sound of agony. He could feel the air pressing down on him, suffocating him, the weight of the darkness crushing him as he sprinted toward the exit. By the time he emerged from the cave, gasping for breath, the screams had stopped. The night was eerily silent, the cool breeze brushing against his sweat-soaked skin. He collapsed onto the ground, his mind racing, his body trembling with fear. He didn't know what he had just experienced, but one thing was clear. The stories about the cave were true. There was something down there, something that thrived on fear, something that would never let him forget the screams. To this day, Shadowcrawler Foifor refuses to speak about what he saw in the cave. He never went back, and he warns anyone who asks about it to stay away, because once you hear the screams, they never truly leave you. 4. The Forgotten Ritual. The cave was a hidden gem, or at least that's what Adventurer Tim thought when he first found it. Tucked away in a remote corner of the forest, it didn't appear on any official maps. There were no signs, no markers, no trails leading to it, just an overgrown entrance concealed by dense foliage. He had stumbled upon it by accident while hiking, and the thrill of discovering something so untouched by human hands was too great to resist. He gathered a small group of friends, all seasoned explorers like himself, and they made plans to return to the cave the following weekend. Armed with flashlights, climbing gear, and plenty of supplies, they were ready to map the cave, document its features, and claim it as their discovery. The first part of the cave was narrow and unremarkable, just a typical rock tunnel with uneven walls and the occasional trickle of water. But as they ventured deeper, the cave opened up into a massive chamber, its ceiling towering high above them, covered in strange iridescent minerals that reflected their flashlight beams like a million tiny stars. It was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but something about it felt off. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the further they walked, the more a strange unease began to settle over the group. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved them, it was the way the cave seemed to absorb every sound, as if the darkness itself was alive, waiting, watching. That's when they found the symbols. Carved into the walls, just barely visible under layers of dust and grime, were a series of intricate, spiraling symbols. They looked ancient, older than anything they had ever seen before, and they seemed to glow faintly under their lights, as if the cave had a life of its own. One of the group members, Sarah, was particularly fascinated by the symbols. She had a background in archaeology and spent a long time examining them, tracing the carvings with her fingers. "These are ritualistic," she murmured, her voice echoing faintly in the vast chamber. "They're old, really old. I don't recognize the exact culture, but I think this was a place of worship." The rest of the group gathered around her, staring at the symbols with growing unease. There was something about them that felt wrong, too deliberate, too purposeful. It was as if the cave wasn't just a natural formation, but a place that had been used for something darker. "Maybe we shouldn't touch them," Adventurer Tim suggested, but Sarah brushed him off. "It's fine," she said, though there was a slight tremor in her voice. "These are just carvings. There's nothing dangerous about them." But as soon as her fingers brushed one of the symbols, the ground beneath them rumbled, and the air grew colder, sharp like the chill of a winter night. The group froze, exchanging uneasy glances as the low hum of the cave intensified. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, casting strange, flickering shadows across the chamber. Then, from the depths of the cave, a sound began to rise. At first, it was low, almost like a distant wind howling through the tunnels. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was chanting. Deep, guttural voices, speaking in a language none of them could understand, reverberated through the chamber, filling the space with an oppressive weight. Panic began to set in. "We need to leave," Adventurer Tim said, his voice tense. But before they could turn back, something strange happened. The shadows, those strange, flickering shadows, began to move. They slithered along the walls, detaching themselves from the carvings, taking on shapes that resembled human figures. But they weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their bodies twisted and grotesque. The figures moved slowly at first, but as the chanting grew louder, they began to advance, surrounding the group. The air in the cave thickened, and the oppressive weight in their chests made it hard to breathe. "Run!" someone screamed, but it was too late. The figures had closed in, their hollow, eyeless faces staring into nothingness, their mouths moving in time with the chanting. Adventurer Tim and his friends scrambled, their panic overtaking any sense of direction. The tunnel seemed to twist and warp around them, leading them in circles. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't seem to find the entrance, as though the cave itself was alive, shifting to trap them. Sarah was the first to fall. The shadows caught her, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her back toward the chamber. She screamed, but the chanting drowned out her voice. The rest of the group could only watch in horror as the shadows consumed her, pulling her into the dark. The others ran blindly, desperately, but the figures followed them, relentless in their pursuit. The tunnel felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading them deeper into the cave's depths, further from the entrance, further from escape. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, Adventurer Tim and the remaining survivors burst out into the open air, gasping for breath. The entrance to the cave stood behind them, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But the others... Sarah and 2 others had never made it out. The shadows had taken them. To this day, Adventurer Tim can still hear the chanting when he closes his eyes at night. The symbols haunt his dreams, and the memory of the figures, those inhuman shadows, linger in the corners of his vision. He never went back to the cave, and he warns anyone who will listen to stay far, far away. Because the ritual was never forgotten, the shadows are still there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to disturb them. 5. The Crawling Horror. Reddit user Cliffhanger88 had always been drawn to tight spaces. For him, caving wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. The narrower, the more claustrophobic the tunnel, the better. There was something about squeezing through the Earth's narrowest cracks that gave him a thrill unlike anything else. His latest expedition, however, would test his limits in ways he never could have imagined. The cave in question was known as the Needle, an underground network of labyrinthine tunnels and perilously tight spaces. It was a notoriously dangerous place to explore, but that only made it more appealing to Cliffhanger88. Along with 2 friends, Steve and Brian, he geared up for what they expected to be the most challenging adventure of their lives. The entrance was relatively simple, a steep descent into a large cavern with narrow passages spidering off in every direction. They consulted their map, which showed multiple levels of tunnels, some barely wide enough to fit through, and chose the most difficult path to begin their descent. The initial crawl was tight, but manageable. The air was damp, the walls slick with condensation, but for the first few hours, it was nothing they hadn't encountered before. As they crawled, laughed, and cracked jokes, the atmosphere remained light and adventurous. But as they pushed deeper into the cave, things began to change. The tunnel they had chosen gradually narrowed, the walls closing in around them. At first, it was just a mild inconvenience. They had to shimmy sideways, squeezing their bodies between jagged rocks. But the thrill of the challenge kept them going. The only sound was the scraping of their clothing against stone, their grunts of exertion, and the rhythmic drip of water from somewhere in the depths. But after a few hours, the space became almost unbearably tight. Cliffhanger88 found himself having to remove his backpack and drag it behind him as he wriggled forward on his stomach, feeling the rough, cold stone pressing against his chest and back. The tunnel was so narrow now that there was barely room to breathe, and each movement felt like a monumental effort. "I think we should turn back," Steve called from behind, his voice strained. But Cliffhanger88 wasn't ready to give up. "We're almost there," he panted, even though he wasn't entirely sure where there was. According to the map, there was supposed to be a small chamber up ahead, a space wide enough to stand in and rest. He pushed on, convinced that they were close. As he crawled forward, something strange happened. The air grew colder, much colder, to the point where he could see his breath misting in the dim light of his headlamp. It wasn't just the temperature that changed. The atmosphere itself felt different, heavy and oppressive, as though the very earth around them was watching, waiting. And then there was the touch. At first he thought it was just his imagination. A light brushing against his leg, so faint that he almost didn't notice it. He froze, his body wedged between the walls of the tunnel, his heart pounding in his chest. He shifted slightly, thinking it might be a loose rock or his backpack scraping against the cave wall. But then it happened again. Something cold and wet, like a slick hand, slid against his ankle. He kicked out reflexively, but there was nothing there. Just the walls of the tunnel pressing in on all sides. He couldn't shake the sensation, though, the feeling of something crawling just behind him, something he couldn't see. "Did you guys feel that?" he called back to Steve and Brian. "What are you talking about?" Brian asked, his voice muffled in the tight space. I thought something touched me," Cliffhanger 88 said, his voice sounding shaky even to himself. "Dude, it's just the cave," Steve replied. "You're probably imagining it. We're in tight quarters. Things rub against you." But Cliffhanger 88 wasn't convinced. The cold, slick touch had felt too deliberate, too real. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as they continued forward, the feeling returned. This time it was more distinct. Something brushed against his arm, then his back, as though it was following him, crawling just out of sight. His anxiety began to rise. The tunnel was growing tighter, and every inch forward felt like a battle against the crushing weight of the earth. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against him, making it difficult to move, to breathe. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rock. But no matter how hard he looked, he saw nothing. That's when the noises started. A soft, rhythmic clicking echoed through the tunnel, barely audible over the sound of their own labored breathing. It was coming from behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Click, click, click. It sounded like something hard tapping against the stone, like claws or nails scraping against the rock. Cliffhanger 88 stopped dead in his tracks. "Guys, do you hear that?" Brian and Steve went silent, listening. The clicking grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was making the sound was getting closer. "I hear it," Brian whispered, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Cliffhanger 88 replied, his heart racing. "But we need to get out of here. Now." They tried to turn around, but the tunnel was too tight. There was no room to maneuver, no space to reverse course. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, unable to go back, forced to push forward into the unknown. The clicking grew louder still, now accompanied by a low, guttural hiss. It was right behind them. Cliffhanger 88 felt a surge of terror, his skin crawling as the sensation of cold, slick fingers brushed against his back again. This time it didn't feel like a mere touch. It felt like something was grabbing him, holding him in place. He thrashed, his body wedged between the walls, his headlamp flickering as he struggled to move. The clicking was deafening now, the hissing louder, as though whatever was following them was inches away. "Go, go," he shouted, urging Brian and Steve to push forward. They scrambled, squeezing through the impossibly tight tunnel, their bodies aching from the exertion. The walls scraped against their skin, the air thick with dust and moisture. And all the while, the clicking followed, relentless, unyielding. Finally, they reached a small opening, a narrow chamber just wide enough for them to sit up. They collapsed into the space, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the relief was short-lived. The clicking had stopped, but the hissing hadn't. It was right behind them, echoing through the tunnel they had just escaped. Slowly, they turned their flashlights toward the entrance of the chamber, their beams illuminating the darkness. What they saw made their blood run cold. The shadows in the tunnel shifted, twisting and writhing as something moved toward them. It was low to the ground, almost snake-like, its body elongated and slick with some kind of wet, glistening substance. But its face was human, or at least it had once been human. The skin was stretched taut over a skeletal frame, its eyes hollow and sunken, its mouth wide open in a silent scream. It crawled toward them on all fours, its long, bony fingers scraping against the stone, leaving trails of wet slime in its wake. The hissing grew louder, more frantic, as it dragged itself closer, its empty eyes fixed on the three of them. Panic overtook them. There was no way back, no way forward. They were trapped. "Get the hell out of here!" Brian screamed, his voice cracking with fear. They scrambled, climbing over each other in a desperate attempt to flee. Steve pushed past them, squeezing into a narrow crevice that led to another tunnel. The others followed, their bodies screaming in pain as they forced themselves through the tight space. The hissing grew louder, the creature crawling after them, faster now, its bony fingers reaching for their ankles. Finally, they burst into a larger chamber, their flashlights illuminating the space. But the creature didn't follow. It stopped at the edge of the tunnel, watching them with its hollow eyes, hissing softly, before retreating into the darkness. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. They ran, their bodies aching, their minds reeling from the terror they had just experienced. By the time they emerged from the cave, gasping for fresh air, the sun had begun to rise, casting a pale light over the entrance. None of them ever returned to the Needle. To this day, Cliffhanger 88 still wakes up in a cold sweat, his skin crawling with the memory of that cold, slick touch and the sound of those relentless clicks echoing in his mind. 6. The Vanishing Lights. It was supposed to be a routine caving trip. Reddit user CaveQuester and their group of friends had been exploring caves for years, and they had never experienced anything out of the ordinary until they visited the cave system known as the Black Tunnels. The Black Tunnels were a sprawling labyrinth of twisting passageways and deep shafts, notorious for their complexity. Many amateur explorers had gotten lost in its depths, but CaveQuester and their group were experienced. They weren't afraid. Equipped with high-quality flashlights, maps, and ropes, the group descended into the cave with their usual excitement. The entrance was wide and welcoming, and the first few hours of their exploration were uneventful. The group bantered and joked as they made their way through the familiar sections of the cave, their lights illuminating the rough, wet stone walls. But as they moved deeper into the cave, something strange began to happen. It started with a flicker, just a quick, almost imperceptible blink in the darkness. CaveQuester noticed it first. His flashlight dimmed for a second, then returned to full brightness. He thought it might be a loose connection or a weak battery, but when he checked the flashlight, everything seemed fine. "Anyone else's light acting weird?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the tunnel. "Nah, mine's good," his friend Alex replied, waving his flashlight back and forth. The beam cut through the darkness without issue. The group pressed on, but the flickering continued. Every few minutes, CaveQuester's light would dim or flicker as if something was interfering with it. At first, he tried to ignore it, but as the hours passed, the flickering grew worse. Soon, it wasn't just his flashlight. Other members of the group began to experience the same issue. The beams of their lights would sputter and blink, plunging them into near darkness for brief moments before flickering back to life. "Weird," Alex muttered, shaking his flashlight. "It's brand new. Batteries should be fine." As they ventured deeper into the tunnels, the flickering became more frequent and more synchronized, as if the very darkness of the cave was fighting against their lights. At times, all of their lights would blink at once, leaving them in total darkness for a split second before the beams flickered back on. Every time it happened, the air seemed to grow colder, and the oppressive weight of the cave pressed down on them harder. The group's mood began to shift. Jokes were replaced with nervous laughter, and conversations became shorter, quieter. No one wanted to admit it, but the flickering lights were starting to unnerve them. Still, they pushed on, determined to complete their exploration. But then something happened that none of them could explain. They had reached a large chamber, the biggest one they had seen so far, with high ceilings and walls covered in strange mineral deposits that shimmered faintly in the dim light. They paused to take a break, sitting down to eat and rest. As they sat in the chamber, their flashlights rested on the ground, illuminating the space around them. Without warning, all of the lights went out. Total, absolute darkness enveloped them. The kind of darkness that presses against your eyes, making it impossible to tell whether they're open or closed. At first, they thought it was just another flicker, but the lights didn't come back on. They scrambled to turn their flashlights back on, but nothing worked. The beams refused to ignite, leaving them blind and trapped in the suffocating blackness. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" one of the group members, Jess, said, her voice trembling with panic. "I don't know," CaveQuester replied, frantically shaking his flashlight. "This doesn't make any sense. These are new batteries." Alex pulled out his backup flashlight and clicked it on, but it didn't work either. Neither did Jess's or anyone else's. No matter what they tried, the lights refused to work. It was as if something in the cave was draining the power from their devices, extinguishing any hope of light. The group huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. They were deep in the cave, miles from the entrance, and now they had no light, no way to navigate the twisting tunnels that led back to the surface. Then, from somewhere deep within the cave, they heard it. A low, soft hum, almost like the sound of wind, but there was no breeze in the cave. The hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through their bones. It was followed by a faint rustling, as though something was moving through the darkness, just beyond their reach. Is someone there?" Alex called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, just the hum, the rustling, and the suffocating darkness. Suddenly, Jess screamed. "Something touched me," she cried, scrambling to her feet. The rest of the group jumped up, panic surging through them. They could feel it now. Something moving in the darkness, brushing against their skin, soft and cold. It was impossible to see, impossible to tell what it was, but the sensation was unmistakable. Something was with them. "We need to get out of here," Cave Quester said, his voice shaking. "We need to find the way back." But without light, navigating the cave was impossible. They stumbled blindly through the chamber, their hands outstretched, feeling for the walls, for any sense of direction. The hum grew louder, more oppressive, as though the very air was vibrating with some unseen force. And then, one by one, their lights came back on. The flashlights flickered to life, casting weak, sputtering beams into the chamber. The group stood frozen, their hearts pounding, as they slowly scanned the room. But there was nothing there. No sign of movement, no sign of anything that could have touched them. Just the shimmering walls of the cave and the deep, impenetrable darkness beyond. "We're leaving. Now," Alex said, his voice firm. No one argued. They gathered their gear and hurried back the way they had come, their lights flickering and dimming sporadically as they moved. Every so often, the hum would return, faint and distant, as though something was following them, watching them from the shadows. By the time they reached the cave entrance and emerged into the daylight, they were exhausted, shaken to their core. None of them could explain what had happened in the black tunnels, and none of them ever returned to the cave. They had experienced something far beyond the ordinary, something that defied logic and reason. To this day, Cave Quester swears that there was something in the cave with them, something that wanted to extinguish their lights, and perhaps something that wanted more than that. 7. The Cave of Lost Time. Reddit user TimeWanderer88 had always been fascinated by the idea of time slips and anomalies. The concept that time could warp or behave differently in certain places had always seemed like science fiction, but stories of such occurrences fascinated him. That's why, when he heard about a cave in the Pacific Northwest, rumored to cause strange experiences with time, he couldn't resist the urge to investigate it for himself. The locals called it the Cave of Lost Time, and it was buried deep within the remote wilderness, far from any hiking trails or landmarks. The cave wasn't large or particularly well known, but there were whispers about it in the small town nearby. Old legends spoke of people entering the cave and coming out days or even weeks later, claiming they had only been inside for a few hours. Others spoke of eerie occurrences, hearing voices from the past, seeing people from another time, or becoming lost in the dark only to find their way out after what felt like minutes, only to discover hours had passed. Intrigued, TimeWanderer88 gathered a few friends, Matt, Jenna, and Claire, and set out to explore the cave one cool autumn morning. The entrance to the cave was unassuming, hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees and underbrush. The only indication they were in the right place was a barely visible trail leading to a small opening in the side of a moss-covered rock formation. They were prepared. Each of them carried extra flashlights, food, water, and a watch to keep track of time. "Let's see if the stories are true," TimeWanderer88 said with a grin as they entered the cave. The first thing they noticed was how quickly the outside world seemed to disappear behind them. The light from the entrance faded rapidly, and within a few minutes they were enveloped in complete darkness, their flashlights the only source of illumination. The cave itself was unremarkable at first, just narrow passages winding deeper into the earth, the walls damp with condensation. But as they ventured further, something strange began to happen. It started with Jenna. She glanced down at her watch and frowned. "Guys, my watch stopped," she said, holding up her wrist. The second hand had frozen in place, stuck at the exact moment they had entered the cave. "Maybe the battery died," Claire suggested, but Jenna shook her head. "It's brand new," she replied, her voice tinged with unease. They dismissed it as a coincidence and kept moving, but soon Matt's watch also stopped, then Claire's. By the time TimeWanderer88 checked his own, it too had stopped. All 4 watches had frozen, stuck at the exact same time, as if the cave itself had decided to halt the passage of time. "Okay, that's weird," Matt said, shining his flashlight around the tunnel. "But it's probably just some kind of interference or magnetic field in the cave, right? That could mess with electronics." "Yeah, maybe," TimeWanderer88 said, though he couldn't shake the growing unease in the pit of his stomach. They pressed on, deeper into the cave, but the further they went, the more disoriented they became. It wasn't just the darkness. The passages seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. They would enter a tunnel, walk for what felt like a few minutes, only to find themselves back where they started, as if the cave was shifting around them. And then there were the echoes, strange, faint sounds that seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes they would hear the distant drip of water. Other times it sounded like whispering voices, too soft to make out. After what felt like hours, they reached a large chamber, the walls covered in strange, glistening mineral formations that shimmered in the glow of their flashlights. The air was cooler here, almost cold, and the silence was suffocating. "We should probably head back," Claire suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this." But when they turned around to retrace their steps, the tunnel they had come through was gone. "What the hell?" Matt said, shining his light around the chamber. There was no entrance, no exit, just solid rock walls all around them. "This isn't possible," Time Wanderer 88 muttered, his heart racing. They hadn't made any turns. They had followed a straight path. There was no way the tunnel could have just disappeared. Panic began to set in. The group split up, each of them searching the walls for any sign of an opening, but there was none. The chamber was sealed, and the air was growing colder by the minute. And then the whispering started again. This time it was clearer. Voices, dozens of them, filling the chamber, overlapping and echoing off the stone walls. The words were still unintelligible, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that made it sound like some kind of chant or ritual. "What is that?" Jenna whispered, her face pale in the dim light. "I don't know," Tim Wanderer 88 replied, but deep down he had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening wasn't natural. It felt like the cave itself was alive, like it was watching them, toying with them. Then, without warning, the voices stopped, and the chamber fell into complete silence once again. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, Time Wanderer 88 noticed something strange. His flashlight beam seemed to waver, as though it was passing through something that wasn't there. He moved the light back and forth, watching as the beam flickered and distorted, and then it hit him. There was something in the air, something they couldn't see. It was like a thin veil, invisible to the naked eye, but when the light passed through it, it rippled, as though it was bending the light itself. "What the hell is that?" Matt asked, stepping closer to the center of the chamber where the distortion was most noticeable. Before Time Wanderer 88 could stop him, Matt reached out and touched the air in front of him. The moment his fingers made contact with the invisible veil, there was a flash of light, and then everything went dark. When Time Wanderer 88 opened his eyes, he was alone. The chamber was still there, but Matt, Jenna, and Claire were gone. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive silence, and the whispers had vanished. He called out their names, but his voice echoed back at him, hollow and empty. Panicking, he checked his watch, but it was still frozen, stuck at the same time as before. He had no idea how long he had been in the cave or where his friends had gone. The tunnel they had come through was still missing, and there was no sign of an exit. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, something strange caught his eye. On the far side of the chamber, where the mineral formations glistened in the light, he saw something etched into the stone, a symbol, faint but unmistakable. It was an hourglass, but instead of sand, the hourglass was filled with spirals, as though time itself was being twisted and pulled in different directions. Suddenly, he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, and the world around him seemed to blur and shift. The chamber tilted, the walls warping and bending in ways that defied logic. He staggered, clutching his head, and then the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. He didn't know how long he stood there, listening to the voices, watching as the cave twisted around him. Time had lost all meaning. Minutes could have passed, or hours, or even days. He couldn't tell. The only thing he knew was that he had to get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted something, an opening, faint and barely visible in the far corner of the chamber. He ran toward it, his heart pounding in his chest, and as he passed through the invisible veil, he felt a sudden jolt, like the world had snapped back into focus. When he emerged from the cave, the sun was shining brightly overhead, but something was wrong. The forest around him looked different. The trees were taller, the foliage thicker, and the trail they had followed to the cave was gone, overgrown with brush and vines. It wasn't until he reached the town that he realized how much time had passed. The date was 3 weeks later. He had only been in the cave for what felt like a few hours, but outside, nearly a month had gone by. No one could explain what had happened, and his friends were still missing. Despite extensive searches, they were never found. The only explanation anyone could offer was that they had become lost in the cave and died. But Time Wanderer 88 knew better. The Cave of Lost Time had taken them, trapped them in a place where time didn't follow the rules. To this day, he still hears the whispers when he closes his eyes, and he knows that somewhere, deep within the cave, time continues to twist and bend, and his friends are still there, lost forever in the folds of eternity. 8. The Deepening Descent. Reddit user Nightcrawler19 had always considered himself a bit of a thrill seeker. Caving, rock climbing, and hiking in remote locations were his passions, and he prided himself on being able to handle any terrain, no matter how dangerous. So when he heard about an uncharted cave system deep in the desert known only as the Abyss, he knew he had to explore it. The Abyss had a reputation among the locals. Those who had tried to explore it often returned shaken, speaking of a cave that seemed to go on forever, a bottomless pit of tunnels that never ended. Some said it wasn't a natural formation, that it was cursed, or even alive. The stories only piqued Nightcrawler 19's curiosity, and he set off to explore it with a friend, Mark. The entrance to the cave was a jagged hole in the side of a rocky canyon, barely wide enough to squeeze through. They had to crawl on their stomachs to enter, sliding down a steep incline that opened up into a wide, sloping tunnel. The walls were smooth and curved, almost as if they had been carved by water, though there was no sign of any moisture. They spent the first few hours exploring the upper tunnels, marking their path with chalk and taking notes on the unusual formations. The deeper they went, the stranger the cave became. The walls were covered in strange, spiraling patterns, and the air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. But the real strangeness began when they reached the lower levels. The further they descended, the more they felt an odd sense of disorientation, as though the tunnel was playing tricks on their minds. The walls seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied logic, and the deeper they went, the more time seemed to slip away. Hours passed, or at least they thought they did. But it was impossible to tell how long they had been in the cave. Their phones and watches had lost signal, and without sunlight to guide them, they were completely at the mercy of the cave. At one point, they reached what appeared to be a dead end, a narrow crevice barely wide enough to fit through. Mark wanted to turn back, but Nightcrawler 19 was determined to press on. He squeezed through the crevice, ignoring the tight space and the claustrophobic pressure of the rock closing in on him. On the other side of the crevice was a long, steep shaft, leading down into darkness. He could see no bottom, but he was certain that if they descended, they would reach a new chamber. The idea of discovering something that no one had ever seen before excited him, and against Mark's better judgment, they set up their gear and began the descent. The shaft was narrow and treacherous, forcing them to rappel down slowly, their flashlights barely illuminating the walls around them. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and the more oppressive the silence grew. It was as if the cave itself was absorbing all sound, leaving them in a void of nothingness. After what felt like hours, they reached the bottom, or so they thought. The moment they touched the ground, the floor gave way beneath them, sending them plummeting even deeper into the earth. They fell for what felt like an eternity, their screams swallowed by the darkness, until they landed hard on a cold, smooth surface. Dazed and bruised, they struggled to their feet, shining their flashlights around to get their bearings. They were in a vast chamber, the walls smooth and featureless, as though they had been polished by some unknown force. The air was freezing, and the silence was absolute. But something about the chamber felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold or the silence. It was the weight of the place, the sense that they were somewhere they shouldn't be. This isn't right, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Nightcrawler 19 couldn't argue. The chamber didn't feel natural. It felt alive. As they stood there, trying to decide what to do next, they heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like the growl of a distant beast, coming from deep within the walls. It started as a faint vibration, but it grew louder, the ground beneath them shaking as though the cave itself was waking up. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice tight with panic. But before they could move, the walls began to shift, slowly at first, then faster, the smooth rock rippling and undulating like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. The tunnel they had come through closed up behind them, the walls sealing themselves as though they had never been there. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, the only exit gone, and the walls continuing to move, reshaping the chamber around them. The low rumbling grew louder, the floor beneath them trembling, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with some unseen force. "We have to move!" Nightcrawler 19 shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was a dead end, and the walls were closing in, twisting and shifting in ways that defied all logic. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The walls were still again, the chamber silent, but the sense of wrongness remained. They stood frozen, waiting for something to happen, but the only sound was their own ragged breathing. I don't think we're supposed to be here," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Nightcrawler 19 agreed. Something about the cave had changed. It was no longer just a cave. It felt like they had crossed into another place, another realm, where the rules of reality no longer applied. "We need to go back," Nightcrawler 19 said, though he had no idea how they were going to find their way out. But as they turned to retrace their steps, they realized that the tunnel they had descended through was gone. In its place was a new tunnel, one that sloped downward even deeper into the earth. There was no sign of the crevice they had crawled through, no chalk marks to guide them back. The cave had changed. With no other choice, they began to descend again, hoping that the new tunnel would lead them back to the surface. But the deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, the tunnel narrowing and widening in unpredictable ways, and the air grew colder with each step. Hours passed, or at least they thought they did. Time had lost all meaning. Their flashlights began to flicker, the batteries drained, though they had only been in the cave for a few hours. Or had it been days? They couldn't tell anymore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached another chamber. This one even larger than the last, with smooth black walls that seemed to absorb the light from their flashlights. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, and in the center of the chamber was a single object, a stone pedestal, ancient and worn, with strange symbols carved into its surface. They approached the pedestal cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. The symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen, spirals and lines that seemed to twist and shift as they looked at them, as though the stone itself was alive. "I don't like this," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But before they could turn away, the ground beneath the pedestal began to tremble, and the walls of the chamber started to shift once again. The air was filled with the same low, rumbling sound, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The walls began to close in, the ceiling lowering, and the tunnel they had come through vanished, sealing them inside the chamber. They were trapped. Nightcrawler 19 felt a wave of panic wash over him as the walls pressed closer, the air growing thinner, colder. The chamber was shrinking, and there was no way out. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Mark whispered, his voice filled with despair. Nightcrawler 19 didn't respond. He knew the truth. The cave had taken them, just as it had taken others before. They were never meant to leave. As the walls closed in, the last thing they heard was the deep, rumbling sound, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, as the darkness swallowed them whole. 9, the Silent Watchers. The cave wasn't on any map. It didn't have a name, and Reddit user CaveWatcher92 had only learned about it through whispers on a caving forum. It was referred to as the Hidden Cave, or the Nameless Grotto, a place so remote that even locals avoided it. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it had never been fully explored because of strange occurrences, but the details were vague. What intrigued CaveWatcher92 the most, though, were the rumors about what lay deep within its tunnels. Statues, human-like figures, carved into the stone, placed there by hands long forgotten. The descriptions were always brief, but consistent, figures standing still, watching as if frozen in time. Fascinated by these cryptic accounts, CaveWatcher92 gathered a small team of experienced cavers. He convinced his friends, Dan and Maria, to join him on the expedition. They were no strangers to caving, having explored various cave systems around the world, but this one would be different. They packed their gear, helmets, headlamps, ropes, and climbing equipment, and set off into the wilderness. The cave's entrance was hidden beneath a dense thicket of trees, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was a narrow opening in the earth, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. As they crawled inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air cool and damp. They turned on their headlamps, the bright beams cutting through the inky darkness, revealing the jagged stone walls of the tunnel. The first part of the cave was fairly straightforward, a winding passage that led deeper and deeper into the earth. It was narrow in places, forcing them to shimmy through tight spaces, but nothing out of the ordinary for seasoned cavers like themselves. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. After about an hour, the tunnel began to widen, and they found themselves standing in a large cavern. The air was heavier here, almost oppressive, and the silence was absolute. Their footsteps no longer echoed, as if the cave was absorbing the sound. That's when they saw the first one. Maria spotted it first, her headlamp beam catching something unusual against the wall. She stopped in her tracks, staring at the figure that stood there, half hidden in the shadows. "What the?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Dan and Cave Watcher 92 followed her gaze, their lights illuminating the figure. It was a statue, human in shape, but unnervingly lifelike. The figure was carved from stone, standing about 6 feet tall, its features hauntingly detailed. Its eyes were hollow, sunken into its face, and its mouth was open, as if frozen mid-scream. The arms were outstretched, fingers grasping at the air. "That's unsettling," Dan said, his voice tinged with unease. "I wasn't expecting it to look so real," Cave Watcher 92 admitted. He had heard about the statues, but seeing one in person was different. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that made his skin crawl. The craftsmanship was too perfect, too precise, as though the statue had once been a living person, frozen in place by some dark magic. They moved closer to inspect the statue, their lights revealing more details. The stone was smooth, unnaturally so, and cold to the touch. There were no visible tool marks, no signs of how it had been carved. It was as if the figure had simply materialized from the rock itself. "Who do you think made these?" Maria asked, running her hand along the statue's arm. "No idea," Cave Watcher 92 replied. "There's no record of any civilization ever living around here. These shouldn't exist." As they continued to explore the cavern, they found more statues, dozens of them, standing in eerie silence, all in various poses. Some were crouching, others reaching upward, their faces twisted in expressions of fear or agony. They were scattered throughout the chamber, some partially embedded in the walls, others standing freely on the floor. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the statues became. There was something about their eyes, empty and hollow, that seemed to follow them, no matter which direction they moved. The silence was oppressive now, weighing heavily on their chests. It was as if the statues were watching them, waiting for something. "Let's keep moving," Dan said, his voice strained. "I don't like this." They pressed on, their nerves fraying as the statues grew more frequent, lining the walls like sentinels. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing them to crawl through tight spaces, the weight of the earth pressing down on them. The deeper they went, the more suffocating the air became, and that's when they heard it. A faint whispering sound just on the edge of hearing. It was so soft that at first they thought it was their imagination. But the more they listened, the clearer it became. It was a voice, low and hoarse, speaking in a language none of them recognized. "Did you hear that?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it's coming from up ahead." They crawled forward, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping and blending together, filling the tunnel with a dissonant chorus of words they couldn't understand. The sound made their skin crawl, and they had to fight the urge to turn back. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into another chamber, this one smaller, more enclosed. The whispering stopped the moment they stepped inside, and the silence that followed was deafening. In the center of the chamber stood a single statue, larger and more detailed than any they had seen before. It was a figure of a man, kneeling on the ground, his head bowed and his hands clasped in front of him as if in prayer. His face was hidden in shadow, but the air around him felt thick with malice. Maria stepped forward to inspect the statue, but as she did, her flashlight flickered. The light dimmed, then sputtered out entirely, plunging the chamber into darkness. "Maria, what happened?" Cave Watcher 92 called out, his voice echoing in the blackness. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. "The light just went out." Dan flicked his flashlight back on, the beam cutting through the darkness. But something was wrong. The statues, the ones they had passed on the way in, were no longer in the same positions. Some of them had moved, their heads tilted at different angles, their hollow eyes staring directly at them. Panic surged through them. "We need to leave," Dan said, his voice trembling. They turned to retrace their steps, but the tunnel behind them had changed. The path they had come through was gone, replaced by a narrow passage that sloped downward, deeper into the earth. No, this isn't right," Cave Watcher 92 muttered, shining his light around frantically. As they turned back toward the center of the chamber, they saw it. The kneeling statue had risen to its feet. Its hollow eyes were fixed on them, and its stone fingers twitched as if testing their mobility. Slowly, deliberately, it began to move toward them. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. The statues that lined the walls shifted again, their heads following the movement of the larger figure as it advanced, its stone feet scraping against the ground. "Run!" Maria screamed, her voice cracking with terror. They bolted for the narrow passage, scrambling through the tight space as fast as they could. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Behind them, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the cave, growing louder with each passing second. By the time they emerged from the cave, gasping for breath, the sun was beginning to set. The entrance yawned open behind them, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. They never spoke of what they had seen inside the cave. Whatever those statues were, whether they had once been human or something else entirely, they had been watching, and they weren't meant to be disturbed. 10. The Cursed Cave. The cave had a reputation, one that went back generations. Locals called it the Devil's Mouth, but its official name on geological surveys was unremarkable. A simple number and a note about it being unexplored. But the stories about it were anything but ordinary. People who ventured into the cave came out different, if they came out at all. There were tales of lost time, strange sightings, and worst of all, those who returned with no memory of the time they spent inside, blank slates with hollow eyes as if a part of them had been left behind. Reddit user SpookHunter77 had grown up hearing the stories. His grandfather had told him about the cave when he was a child, warning him never to go near it. But as he grew older, his curiosity outweighed the fear. He became obsessed with the idea of discovering what made the cave so dangerous. He was convinced it was nothing more than a local legend, a spooky story designed to keep kids from wandering off into the wilderness. And so, after years of planning and researching, he finally decided to explore it for himself. He didn't go alone. He brought 2 friends with him, Tom and Lisa, both of whom were as skeptical as he was. Armed with flashlights, ropes, and recording equipment, they set out early one morning, determined to find the truth behind the legend of the cursed cave. The entrance to the cave was unremarkable, a narrow crack in a rocky hillside, surrounded by thick forest. There were no signs, no warnings, just an eerie silence that hung in the air. As they approached, a cold wind seemed to sweep out of the cave, chilling them to the bone despite the warm weather. "This place is creepy," Lisa said, rubbing her arms as she stared into the darkness. Tom laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a cave. We've been in creepier places." SpookHunter77 smiled, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his stomach. "Yeah, we'll be in and out in a few hours. Let's get this over with." They descended into the cave, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the walls slick with moisture. After about 20 minutes of walking, they reached the first chamber, a wide open space with jagged stalactites hanging from the ceiling like the teeth of a massive, slumbering beast. "This is it?" Tom asked, his voice echoing off the walls. "Doesn't seem so bad." But as soon as the words left his mouth, something strange happened. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier, and the light from their flashlights dimmed, as if being swallowed by the darkness. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone. Lisa frowned, shining her light around the chamber. "Did you hear that?" They all went still, listening. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a soft whispering, like the distant sound of voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. "What the hell is that?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with fear. "I don't know," SpookHunter77 replied, his heart pounding in his chest, "but it doesn't feel right." As they stood there, the shadows seemed to grow darker, closing in around them. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were calling out to them, pleading for something. Suddenly, Lisa's flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn it," she muttered, smacking it against her palm. "It's dead." But it wasn't just her flashlight. One by one, their lights began to fail, flickering weakly before going out entirely. They were plunged into darkness, the oppressive silence broken only by the eerie whispering that now filled the chamber. Panic surged through them. They fumbled for their backup lights, but they wouldn't turn on. It was as if the cave was draining the power from their equipment, leaving them blind and vulnerable. "We need to get out of here," Spook Hunter 77 said, his voice trembling. "Now." They turned to retrace their steps, but the tunnel they had come through was gone. In its place was a solid wall of stone, as if the cave had sealed itself off, trapping them inside. No, this can't be happening," Lisa whispered, her voice filled with terror. Tom pounded on the wall, his fists making dull thuds against the unyielding rock. "What the hell is going on?" As they stood there, the whispering changed. It grew louder, more urgent, and the words became clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were voices, overlapping and blending together, speaking directly to them. "Join us!" The words sent a chill down their spines. They turned, shining their dimming lights back into the chamber, and that's when they saw them. Figures, vague, shadowy shapes emerged from the darkness, their forms barely visible in the faint light. There were dozens of them, standing at the edges of the chamber, watching in silence. Their eyes, if they had eyes, were empty voids, and their bodies seemed to shimmer and waver, as if they weren't entirely solid. "What the hell?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting. "We need to move," Spook Hunter 77 said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to find another way out." They backed away from the figures, moving toward a narrow passage on the other side of the chamber. The shadows didn't follow, but the whispering grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling their heads with a dizzying chorus of voices. As they entered the passage, the air grew colder, the walls pressing in on them. The tunnel twisted and turned, disorienting them, and no matter how far they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The whispering never stopped, growing fainter but never completely fading away. After what felt like hours of wandering, they emerged into another chamber, identical to the first. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. It wasn't a shadow this time, it was a person, or at least it had once been a person. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared vacantly ahead, and in its hand it held a small, cracked pocket watch. As they approached, the figure lifted its head, its jaw opening in a slow, creaking motion. "You're too late," it whispered, its voice rasping and broken. "It's already taken you." The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the walls of the chamber started to close in. The whispering voices rose to a deafening crescendo, filling their minds with a cacophony of madness. They tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls sealed them in, the air growing thinner, colder. The last thing Spook Hunter 77 saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's empty eyes staring back at him, filled with a silent, eternal hunger. Days later, a search party found their bodies near the entrance to the cave. They had never ventured inside, according to the searchers' accounts, but they were found lying on the ground, their faces pale, their eyes open and blank. It was as if they had seen something so terrible that their minds had simply shut down, leaving only their hollow shells behind. To this day, the cave remains sealed, the legend of its curse growing stronger with each passing year. And those who knew Spook Hunter 77 know that whatever lurks inside that cave, whatever took him and his friends, is still there waiting for its next victim.